My name is Joyce Francis. I'm a member of the NAUA Academy Advisory Committee, and I am today hosting our monthly meeting. And I am delighted that Terry Anderson is our speaker today. And I'm going to ask that all of you keep yourselves muted during his presentation. The NAUA Academy is dedicated to supporting and promoting the practice of liberal religion by embracing freedom, reason, and tolerance, rooted in our commitment to the inherent worth and dignity of every person and all peoples. The NAUA Academy offers monthly programming on issues of concern in contemporary society and from our liberal religious perspective. I live in Port Townsend on the Olympic Peninsula, but today I'm joining you from Tucson, Arizona. I hope you will add your location after your name, as I have done. We're becoming an international organization with new participants and members joining as far away as South America and Europe. And it's interesting to see the geographic spread of our audience. You can rename yourself by clicking on the three dots next to your picture in the participant list in the upper. So in the upper right, three dots of your picture or in the participant list, both work. Today's presenter is Terry Anderson. Good that you're presenting today's Academy program, Terry. Terry is a professor emeritus and former Canada Research Chair in the Center for Distance Education and Technology Enhancement Knowledge Research Center, WHOA, at Athabasca University. Am I saying that right, Terry?
You are.
Well, good for me, Alberta, Canada. He has published widely in the area of distance education and educational technology. He's authored or edited 10 books and over 90 peer-reviewed papers. In his private life, Terry has been an active Unitarian for over 50 years in 4 different Canadian Unitarian congregations and currently serves on the NAU board and the NAU Academy Advisory Board. He lives in Alberta, Canada with his wife, Susan, and spends his spare time playing the hammered dulcimer, hiking, gardening, reading, and watching way too many Netflix videos, he tells us. You will note that we are recording, and Ken Ing today is our able tech support. The presentation will be about 1 hour, and that recording will be available soon on the NAUA website, naunitarians.org. For those joining us live, we will then stop the recording and move to a Q&A answer period for about 30 minutes, followed by breakout rooms possibly for another half hour. But during Terry's presentation, I do ask that you all remain muted. So Terry, with no further ado, I am going to unspotlight myself and leave this in your capable hands.
Okay, well, thank you, Joyce, and thank each of you who've taken the time to join this presentation. I will start by, I've got slides that I wish to share. Let me just share the colorblindness. Is it part of the problem or part of the solution? And so what I'm going to do is talk about Coleman Hughes in particular, and I've got about I think it's a 12 or 13 minute video that I'd like to play, which is his infamous TED Talk. And I thought that it would be good for you to judge for yourself the validity of the argument that he's making in the video. Then I'll talk about the reaction to it and some of the backlash that came from just even talking about colorblindness or advocating for it. Then Hughes has got a new book out, The End of Race Politics. And I'll overview some of the main points from that book. And then I'd like to get into a little bit of Sheena Mason, not quite as famous, but she's an academic from New York. And she's published a thing called The Theory of Racelessness. And I'd like to overview that. And then finally, I've got some of the counter arguments for why it is important to have a race-based policies. So when I first started, well, actually, when I read Coleman Hughes's blog post where he described what had happened to him when he'd done this TED Talk, it was sort of like when Todd Eckloff published that book, and everyone said it was so bad. Well, of course, everyone had to read it to see how bad it was, and so then I had to watch the TED Talk, and I couldn't really get what all the controversy was about. And so once I started, digesting his treatment and the kind of this war, I thought, well, I'm just going to jump in there and be a cultural warrior and argue for this colorblindness approach to combating racism. And but then I thought, as I mellowed, I guess, and I kind of read sort of conflicting ideas and points, I thought I would like to end with a little bit of sort of a counter argument, but showing that there is room for debate. And what we desperately need in the world is honest and open discussion and debate so that we can grow knowledge together. So colorblindness as a concept, there was a group called Race to Dinner that formed shortly, just after the start of the pandemic, when Black Lives Matter was really in focus. And it was a group of white women who would get together, and there'd be a couple of hosts, and they would invite a bunch of their friends, and they would have dinner, and then they would talk about race. And one of the participants started, or the part I saw, she said, well, I believe in colorblindness when it comes to race. And the host just jumped all over her as if she'd, said the N-word or something, as if that was the most racist thing you could say. And I thought, whoa, I didn't realize that. I always thought that the civil rights leaders from the 60s, that this was our aspiration. This was what we were trying to do, was to be colorblind. But then I realized that it hit some wrong nerves or offended some other sensibilities at the time. And but I didn't say anything about it, or I didn't join the battle at that point because, well, actually, we don't really use that term very much here in Canada. I don't know, but anyways, I knew what it meant, and but I found out that it was politically incorrect to be colorblind, at least in some areas. So start out with a couple of definitions of what is race. It's a really young concept, and Bruce has often said it wasn't until the white people came that there was any black people in Africa. Before that, they were Tutus and Hutsis and all sorts of other people, but they just weren't defined by their race. It's a nebulous concept. It's difficult to say how many races there are, or if what differentiates one race from another. And we have created them and with this concept of racism, and we've used it for some terrible purposes. As a justification for chattel slavery is probably the most extreme example, but it's also used to bolster a false sense of superiority among some groups, and to economically marginalize social classes or highly questioning ways of acquiring information about people. And I think that's one of the things that Hughes talks about a lot, is that when you say that somebody is a white person or a black person or whatever, what does it really tell you? It doesn't tell you how much education he's got. It doesn't tell him what they think about, what sports they like, what car they drive. It doesn't really tell you very much about them. And so why has it become a kind of a defining feature of us? So a racist statement is characterize the world of ideas and other people through the lens of one's own racial biases. So let's get to Coleman. He's a very successful young man. He's only 28, American writer, podcast host. He's got 176,000 people following his podcast. And he came from a well-educated background. He went to NAUA Academy High School, went to Columbia University, graduated there, and he's both a writer and a broadcaster. And you can see the list of publications that he publishes in. And he's a jazz trombonist and seems like a very interesting young man, at least compared to myself. So he was asked to do a TED Talk in 2023. And I'm sure most of you have seen TED Talks. Some of the TED Talks, the most popular ones, get well over 1 million different views. And in fact, I was in Vancouver, not in 2023, but it was held there in 2016, I think. And I thought, well, I'm here. I'll go and watch a TED Talk live. But I didn't realize you had to pay, I think it was $550 just to walk in the door and clap for after these 10 minutes talk. So I didn't go. But anyways, he did a talk called A Case for Colorblindness. And he said that it was the most rehearsed talk that he had ever done. He said the TED Talk staff made him go over and over and how he was looking and pacing and this and that. And then at the end of it, he got a good round of applause. And Chris Anderson, the founder of the TED Talk, even came out and shook his hand and asked him a few questions. And so he thought it was a great success. And he went home just waiting to see it be released and see how many hundreds of thousands of people were to watch it. But that did not happen. It wasn't released immediately. And I think without further ado, what I'd like to do is just play it for you at this point. And I think I've got it on another.
I want to do a quick exercise. Close your eyes. I want you to picture your best friend. Think about what specifically you love about them. What trait makes them them? Now open your eyes. I don't know what each of you came up with, but I'm pretty sure I know what you didn't come up with. I'm pretty sure none of you thought, what makes Jim Jim is the fact that he's 6'2" and a redhead. I'm guessing you chose their inner qualities, their sense of humor, their generosity, their intelligence, qualities they would have no matter what they looked like. There's one more quality I'm pretty sure you didn't choose, their race. Of all the things you could list about somebody, their race is just about the least interesting you could name, right down there with height and hair color. Sure, race can be good source material for jokes at a comedy club, but in the real world, a person's race doesn't tell you whether they're kind or selfish, whether their beliefs are right or wrong, whether they'll become your best friend or your worst enemy. But over the past 10 years, our societies have become more and more fixated on racial identity. We've all been invited to reflect on our inner whiteness or inner blackness as if these racial essences define who we are. Meanwhile, American society has experienced the greatest crisis in race relations in a generation. Gallup has been asking Americans how they feel about race relations, and this chart is the result. So as you can see, between 2001 and 2013, most Americans felt good about race relations. Then both lines take a nosedive. It's no exaggeration to call this one of the greatest crises of our time. And clearly, we need new ways of thinking about race if we're going to reverse this trend. So today, I'm going to offer an old idea, but it's an idea that's been widely misunderstood. You've probably heard it before. It's called colorblindness. What do I mean by colorblindness? After all, we all see race. We can't help it. What's more, race can influence how we're treated and how we treat other people. So in that sense, nobody is truly colorblind. But to interpret the word colorblind so literally is to misunderstand it. Colorblind is a word like warm-hearted. It uses a physical metaphor to capture an abstract idea. To call someone warm-hearted isn't to talk about the temperature of their heart, but about the kindness of their soul. And similarly, to advocate for colorblindness is not to pretend you don't notice race. It's to support a principle that we should try our best to treat people without regard to race, both in our personal lives and in our public policy. And you might be thinking, what's so controversial about that? Well, the fact is, the philosophy of colorblindness is under attack. Critics say that it's naive, or that we're not yet ready for it as a society, or even that it's white supremacy in disguise. And many people agree with these feelings. For example, a few years ago, a young adult fantasy author came under pressure to halt the release of her new book. Why? Because the marketing blurb for the book went like this: in a world where the princess is the monster, oppression is blind to skin color, and good and evil exist in shades of gray. Now, that one sentence clause about oppression being blind to skin color, describing a fantasy world, mind you, was enough to provoke an online backlash. Now, part of this reaction to color blindness is actually the fault of its advocates. People will say things like, "I don't see color," as a way of expressing support for color blindness. But this phrase is guaranteed to produce confusion because you do see color, right? I think we should all get rid of this phrase and replace it with what we really mean to say, which is, I try to treat people without regard to race. Now, that said, most of the pushback to color blindness comes from critics who misrepresent it as somehow a conservative idea. Now, this could not be further from the truth. The philosophy of color blindness does not come from conservatives. It actually comes from the radical wing of the anti-slavery movement in the 19th century. The earliest mentions of colorblindness come from Wendell Phillips, who was the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society and a man whose nickname was Abolition's Golden Trumpet. He believed in immediate full equality for Black Americans, and in 1865, he called for the creation of a, quote, government colorblind, by which he meant the permanent end of all laws that mention race. What about the other critiques of colorblindness? Wouldn't colorblindness render us unable to fight racism? Wouldn't it mean getting rid of policies like affirmative action that benefit people of color? I believe that eliminating race-based policies does not equal eliminating policies meant to reduce inequality. It simply means that those policies should be executed on the basis of class instead of race. Why class over race? I'll give two reasons. First, because class is almost always a better proxy for true disadvantage than race. Imagine we picked 10 Americans at random, and our task is to sort them from least privileged on one end to most privileged on the other. Now, there's no direct measure of privilege, so we have to choose a proxy measure. My claim here is that lining them up by income or wealth would get us closer to achieving that task than simply lining people up by race. That's what I mean when I say that class is usually a better proxy for disadvantage than race. And the second reason is that class-based policies tend to be more popular and less controversial because they don't penalize anyone for immutable biological traits. Think of policies like need-based financial aid or the earned income tax credit. These are policies that address inequality without anyone having to feel the sting of racial discrimination. I want to give you an example of a disastrous race-based policy. It was called the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. Over 70,000 restaurants closed in 2020 due to the pandemic, and this fund allocated $29 billion to help these restaurants. But for the first 3 weeks of the program, only people of color, women, and veterans could apply. So soon after it began, white male restaurant owners sued, alleging discrimination. A judge ruled in their favor and the program was stopped, but by that time, 2/3 of the money was already gone. And it wasn't just white men that got discriminated against in this policy. Around 3,000 women and people of color were promised money before the judge stopped the program and then unpromised that money just after. And the remaining $10 billion then went to white men who had initially been put at the back of the line. So the net result of this policy was a double dose of discrimination. Initially, thousands of white men were discriminated against, and then thousands of women and people of color were discriminated against. And it's a virtual guarantee that there are people out there who lost their restaurant in both of those camps because they were the wrong skin color. Can anyone really argue that a colorblind program wouldn't have produced better results for everybody? So I just gave an example of a disastrous race-based policy. Now I want to give you an example of a colorblind policy that has worked quite well. America has been struggling with the issue of racial bias in policing for a very long time. And a solution to one aspect of this problem is to issue tickets using traffic cameras instead of human beings. Cops can be racially biased, consciously or not, but traffic cameras, red light cameras, and speeding cameras can't. So you would think anyone interested in reducing racial bias in policing would support these traffic cameras, but you'd be wrong. Some have opposed them on the grounds that they don't yield statistically equal ticketing rates by race, and they remain illegal in many US states. So here's an example where the philosophy of colorblindness cuts through confusion like a knife. If we're guided by colorblindness, our goal should be to eliminate bias from systems that affect people's lives wherever possible, not to manufacture statistically equal outcomes by any means necessary. So my talk has been focused on America, but my message is really for any key decision maker at any institution anywhere in the world. If you care about fighting racism, embrace colorblindness. Support class-based policies. Create colorblind processes in your own world. If you're a professor, grade your students' papers blind to their names. Think creatively about how to apply colorblindness to your life. Colorblindness is the best principle by which to govern a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. It's the best way to lower the temperature of tribal conflict in the long run. And if we wait for the moment when society is ready for it, we'll be waiting forever. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I hope that you get a sense of both what the argument is and who Coleman Hughes is from that video. Let me now just share my screen one more time, only this time back to PowerPoint. So Black Hat Hughes reacted, said that this is not an appropriate talk for TED Talks, that we don't deal with controversial topics like that. And of course, Coleman Hughes found numerous examples of TED Talks that were had a bias in favor of the argument that the speaker was giving. So they went back and forth for a while, and finally Hughes was quite incensed and talked to Chris Anderson at some length about what we could do to resolve it. And eventually it was resolved, but only if they would record a debate afterwards. And that took place Bowie, he's also a newspaper man from New York, and basically they had a very civilized debate. And I think what they both ended up concluding from it was that class as a basis for government policy and decision making is probably more fair than using color. But I also think the major point that Bowie made was that there's lots of inequality and disparity between income and educational levels, criminal records, that is correlated with race, with the idea that because there is this correlation, it must be racism that is the root of this evil. Okay. If you're interested in reading Hughes, his response, this is the blog post that first got me going. Why is Ted scared of colorblindness? And he goes through the history of it all. Just earlier this year, Coleman released a new book, The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. And it's an interesting book. It's not that long, and it basically takes the gloves off. And it says that, I'm hoping you can read those. Is it blocked out? There we go. Anti-racism is really a sheep or a wolf in sheep's clothing, with the anti-racists saying dismantle racism now, and it's really the wolf who's saying I thrive on race. And so he takes the gloves off and he says, don't call these anti-race activists, call them what they are, racists and neo-racists. And it's a new race obsession that brands itself as race anti-racist. And I'm sure we see that in many of our organizations today. And now I have covered up my forward screen. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the in the book, the myths of. In the book, he covers, first of all, he covers at some length the historical background, as he mentioned in the TED Talk, and then he goes through 7 myths. And the first is the disparity fallacy, the fact that because income is correlated with race, it doesn't mean necessarily that race is the cause, that there are demographic differences, there's age differences, educational differences, and there's cultural differences. And I think we're all aware of that if you look at say basketball, which is dominant professional basketball by black basketball players, I think you'd have a hard time case making that white basketball players are discriminated against. It's just that basketball is part of American black culture, and they succeed at it, and they're very good at it. And the next myth that he tries to dismantle is the myth of undoing the past, as if we know there were some awful things done, especially in slavery days. But here in Canada, under colonialism, there was many people were forced off their land and had their children taken away. And the idea is that we should be able to do something better, do something different. And the problem is that many of these people, of course, are long dead. And the question is, are their descendants entitled to these same reparations? The next is the myth of no progress, and I think that it's hard to ignore that fact. If you look at the representation in professional circles, in education, of people of different racial backgrounds, you'll see that it's much higher than it was X number of years ago, and continues to increase. The myth of no progress, that we haven't really improved things. The myth of inherited trauma, and I'm not so sure I agree with this from a psychological point of view, in the sense that he's saying that, because your great grandfather was enslaved, doesn't necessarily mean that it's, that it's somehow made you trauma filled or susceptible to trauma. But I know that we know that the way people are raised reflects how they raise children, and I think that irresponsible and sometimes really dangerous ways of working in families can be passed along for many generations. The next is the racial ad hominem arguments, where you can say, oh, he's a white person, and that's why he's doing that, or he's a black person. And you can imagine more exceptions to those kind of rules than there are validity in particular individuals who might say them or hold them. And it's easy to just, instead of listening to what the person is saying and trying to come to terms with it, or to argue, or to refute it, if we only think about, oh, well, what's his background, or what color is he, or what color is his hair, or what kind of clothing does he wear, to not listen is a real challenge. The myth of superior knowledge and lived experience, the idea that you can't really talk about race unless you are this color or that color, or you've been in this country or done that. And because you have a superior knowledge than somebody who hasn't had that experience. I mean, we all have had lived experience. In fact, it raises the question of, can you imagine an unlived experience? Like I said, it'll only be zombies who can think in those terms, but all experience is lived experience. And then finally, the one that I think we hear in academia a lot is the myth of Black weakness. So that even if a Black person or a First Nations person here in Canada achieves high success in the academy or in business, to suggest that it's only because they're taking advantage of their racial identity and that they're really much weaker. I think that it downplays the contributions that the people of many color can and do make, or many races. Okay, so I see that Dick is here, and I did want to put in a plug if you want to get a more serious look or a more in-depth look. Dick's book review of The End of Race Politics is at that link that you see on the screen. And I have posted these slides to SlideShare so you can see the slides, and of course the video will be recorded as Joyce mentioned. But yeah, thank you, Dick, for that cognizant it was a great review. And so what is one of the things they talk about is in academia anyways, we have to have more First Nations, we have to have more people of Black color, or and the problem is they say it's so that we can get a Black perspective on the issue. And when you accede to demands to view racial status as intellectual credential, first legitimizing the notion of racial credentials imperils the idea of a cosmopolitan intellectual community in which stereotyping expectations imposed upon individuals work by his or her race. One hears that there's need to consult the racial identity candidates for citation or for faculty positions in order to attain a racial perspective. For example, we want a Black perspective on this talk. But what makes the thing a Black perspective? I mean, who has to have it, or who has to say it? It's so subjective and perhaps meaningless. And one of the things that all of these authors who I've been talking about, they also focus on caste. And I hope that you have had a chance to read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. It's a fascinating book where she goes around the world to Nazi Germany or to India, to America, and she finds that it isn't so much about race, it's about caste and the way it's been mistreated and has allowed others to mistreat their fellow citizens. And there's a really interesting movie. It's called Origin, and it was not released, at least in Canada, at the theaters, but you can watch it online. And it's about Wilkerson. She's a Pulitzer Award-winning journalist as she takes on this task of investigating and writing this book, and follows her in her writing of the book. So it's kind of a book about her writing a book, and both are well worth watching. So next, I just want to briefly introduce Sheena Mason. I first heard her interviewed on a podcast as I was walking around and listening to podcasts on my daily hike. And I heard this woman being interviewed, and she said that the reason we have racism is because we have race, and that race causes racism. And so I thought I better find out more about this person. And so Sheena Mason, she's an American literature scholar from one of the SUNY State University of New York campuses. She's coined the term a theory of racelessness, and she wrote a book about 3 years ago, but it doesn't seem to be widely available. It's a theory that presents a pathway towards dismantling entrenched structures of racism and fosters a society that celebrates the richness of individual and collective identities unrestricted by racism. So there's a quote by one of her colleagues is that her teaching, scholarship, and service consistent, unwavering promotes anti-racism, which is necessarily differs from traditional thoughts and practice about racism. And she's launched a Raceless Anti-Racism e-learning site. She does talks, she does has videos on there, and it's an interesting site, and you can learn a lot more both about her and about her ideas. So what I'd like to do is to show you
What if we reimagine the world without racism? What if the idea of race as we know it was neither biological nor a social construct? Welcome to the theory of racelessness, a paradigm shift that challenges and deconstructs the very foundation of our understanding of human diversity and racism. This theory takes a bold stance, asserting that it is not race, but racism, that is a human-made construction. Racism, it contends, is shaped by historical and cultural forces rather than by intrinsic or extrinsic qualities of human identity. It is not race, but the belief in race and the practice of racialization that create and perpetuate complex power dynamics. So, how does the theory of racelessness approach this? It operates under a set of core principles. First, our belief in race and practice of racialization are not meaningless. They hide behind them both racism and valuable aspects of humanity. Second, race does not exist in nature for humans or as a social construct. We are all racialized, but we are inherently raceless. Third, racism is an oppressive system that requires the belief in race and the practice of racialization to reinforce power imbalances. Fourth, racialization is the process of applying an inescapable social hierarchy. And finally, racism does not exist everywhere in the same way and can be overcome. The theory of racelessness rejects essentialism and encourages the dismantling of racism by dispelling deeply ingrained beliefs in discrete human races. It introduces the Racelessness Translator, a tool that converts perceptions framed in terms of race into more precise language such as culture, ethnicity, economic class, social class, racism itself, or some combination. This theoretical framework brings in philosophical concepts, including lesser-known and often misunderstood philosophies of race, to help understand and navigate the intricate terrain of racism. Concepts like racial skepticism and eliminativism, or constructionist eliminativism, architecture, madness, twilight, the walking negative, rememory, invisible ink, consolation, maternal energy, diaspora, nation, and home. They serve as analytical instruments aimed at unification, healing, and reconciliation. Crucially, the theory recognizes racism as a socio-structural phenomenon, not an inherent trait of individuals or groups. It is the belief in race and the subsequent practice of racialization that serve to maintain economic and social power imbalances. So, what if we imagined the world without racism and then worked to create such a world? With the theory of racelessness, we can start to envision such a world and work toward it together.
Okay.
So it gives you an overview. I couldn't find a really short video of Sheena saying that herself, but the core tenets, there's 6 of them that I've listed here. Racism is a socially constructed system. I think we almost all agree with that. Belief in race and the practice of racialization to reinforce power imbalances. Again, getting back to the class issues. Race is an imaginary part of the socially constructed reality of racism. Racialization is the process of applying an inescapable and economic social class theory. And the belief in race and practice of racialization affect people differently. These differences serve to uphold the machinery of racism, adding obstacles to unification, healing, and reconciliation. Translation of what one means by race, including the presumed absence of race in any context, can lead to understanding and bridge making. The raceless translator helps people interpret race into something being said about the causes and effect of racism, culture, ethnicity, social class, economic class, or some combination. And finally, racism does not exist in the same way, and it can be ended. So she's very hopeful that that we're sort of on a dead end when we put a spotlight or a highlight on race. And just a quote from a friend of hers, she's her site is very interesting because she uses a lot of video or and graphics to animate it, but and she's got a new book, The Raceless Anti-Racist, and it's already out for order on Amazon, but it was out in January, but it isn't to be delivered until October. So you're really hoping that it actually gets published. Here's the kind of work that she has on the website. We can do anything together. Let's begin with the racial act of stepping into our racelessness and embracing each other's racelessness. Together, we can stop attaching freedom from racism only to whiteness and people who get racialized as white. And finally, she's very hopeful that we can overcome racialism. So you have these, we see this in the in our Unitarian circles, the people who are arguing, as Coleman Hughes and Sheena Mason do, that having a colored blind is the best way to go. Whereas other people say, no, no, no. If you don't see color, it's because it's systemic racism. It's so embedded within the culture or society or your own brain that you either refuse to or cannot see it. So I just want to end with a few slides of some sort of counter arguments. And here's from our friends at Beacon Press, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. I have not read this book, but this is from the Amazon site promoting it, is that Americans are kind of sort of maybe waking up to the reality that our racial politics are still garbage. But in the midst of this reckoning, widespread denial and misunderstandings about race persist, even as white supremacy and racial injustice are more visible than ever before. I just find that astounding to think that somebody would say that white supremacy is more visible today than it was in the 1930s. It's just kind of nonsense in my mind anyways. But to be fair, I haven't read this book, so and I don't think I will. Another interesting experience I had when I was doing my PhD research, I was working in distance education, and distance education for 100 years has been correspondent lessons sent out through the mail. But all of a sudden we started having audio teleconferencing, and that's where we would get a class, but the class would be made up of 2 people from this community, 4 from that one from this community, and they would all go to a learning center, and they would gather around a table, and there would be a speakerphone there with multiple microphones, and it would allow a teacher in a university, probably in Thunder Bay in my case, to talk to maybe 8 different communities with 2 or 3 people in each community. And I spent some amount of time going around and talking to students about their experience of a class this way. It was kind of a really early experience of COVID Zooming, but of course there was no video; it was just straight audio. And one of the women that I interviewed was an Algonquin woman, and I said, "Well, do you tell the other people about that you're a Native Indian?" Or do you just talk as if you're just one of the classmates? And she says, of course I tell them. She says, that's who I am. I'm a First Nations person and proud of it. And so it was really important for her to have that racial identity. And you can see that in the quote, if you don't see black, you don't see me. So people are racialized, as Sheena Mason says, even down in their own souls. They see themselves as a white person or a black person. Whereas I think, and maybe it's just the luxury of being a white person, I've never really thought too much about being a white person. And well, maybe again, that's my inner bias. So then Nicole Hannah-Jones, who many of you will know from her infamous writing in the New York Times, the 16, is it 14 project or whatever? But she wrote quite a long essay in there called "The Color Blindness Trap" after Hughes's podcast got so many views. And she said that the descendants of American slaves have suffered a continual disadvantage since slavery was abolished. The historical residue of this discrimination is still with us. The problem needs to be made right by some form of reparations. And you can't do reparations if you're colorblind. A colorblind cannot make things right. We must have some form of affirmative action. But she's very clear that this isn't about Black people. This is about descendants of slaves. It is slavery and slavery alone that must be considered in affirmative action, not other historical forms of racial discrimination. And she says we're not really interested in increasing diversity. We're talking about fairness for a particular group of people or their descendants. And then she also notes that there is some division, even amongst, well, Martin Luther King wrote so much and said so much that it's easy to cherry pick things that support whatever view you want to argue. And of course, we're all familiar with the March on Washington and his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But he also wrote, "A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for him." So what she's doing again is arguing the case for some sort of affirmative actions or reparations. Another quote, Ada Wingfield from 2015. By claiming that you do not see race, they also can avert their eyes from the ways in which well-meaning people engage in practices that reproduce neighborhood and school segregation, rely on soft skills in ways that disadvantage racial minorities in the job market, and hoard opportunities in ways that reserve access to better jobs for their white peers. So just there's only a few of us here from Canada, but we've been going through a truth and reconciliation process for the past 10 years with First Nations people in Canada. And we have a long history of our colonial government taking land away, taking advantage of Native people in numerous ways. And the most infamous was the residential schools, where children were forced by law, or their parents were forced by law to have them come to these residential schools, where abuse was quite common, and racial intolerance was the order of the day. So there's been a number of reparations. The first one to individuals, where they received cash money for the years that they were in residential schools. But then a more recent and much larger $2 billion suit over cultural genocide at residential schools and deficits in family services. And this class action was brought by 325 First Nations themselves, and they were successful in negotiating that. That $2 billion will be paid over a number of years, and it's especially targeted at services for young people and for families. Interesting, though, they made no payments for descendants of residential schools. And we also see racism in politics of the left. Here's a recent, I don't know when it was, this year, a quote from President Biden, where he said, "If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, you ain't Black." And a number of Black intellectuals really reacted against that. It's, again, white people telling Black people how to think or what they should be thinking. And so I think we have to be careful that we're not sort of falling into this racist game ourselves at all times. And then there's increasingly there's a number of articles who are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion training, which again has swept through organizations like the university I worked with, and most Canadian universities have full-time staff doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Many companies have. You're starting to see a backlash against it because the empirical results are showing that it isn't really making much difference. It's just employing a bunch more bureaucrats, basically. So to conclude, I think we need to rethink the focus on race as a meaningful and useful way to develop public policy and private interactions. We do have a legacy of racism, but do we solve it by sort of affirmative racism, or do we solve it by, getting back to a raceless, and maybe as Coleman Hughes has suggested, it's a class issue, a money issue, an education issue. But huge social inequalities are highly correlated with race. And we need to constantly affirm, support, and realize the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So I put the slides up there. I'll just, well, you'll be able to see that, or if you go to SlideShare and just type in Terry Anderson, you'll see it there if you're interested in following these links yourself. So I'll leave you with a couple of questions for our discussion. Is colorblindness only an aspirational goal and not to be used for practical decision-making? And secondly, does colorblindness as a driver of policy and programs work better than DEI initiatives or other race-conscious approaches?
Thank you, Terry. You've covered a really important issue facing us as Unitarians, as well as the country at large. And so I know your audience will have questions and concerns. There's already a hand raised, but I'm going to ask Dick to hold just a moment.